face lies the slate and the sun in my disgrace.
Hi everyone, I'm back for new episodes since almost a year. I thought I want to be back to telling these stories and enjoying connecting with people online. To be honest, in the past year a lot of stuff happened and oh my god, I feel so nervous right now because it's been almost a year actually since I uploaded a video here, and I wanted to thank those fans of the Pretty Reckless and Chris Cornell who watched the Pretty Reckless video. They were so supportive and I got lots of positive feedback, which I was really surprised by. Today we remember Chris Cornell, so let's get into it. So, Chris Cornell was born as Christopher John Boyle in 1964 in Seattle, Washington, to Edward Boyle, who was a pharmacist, and Karen Cornell, who was a self proclaimed psychic. They lived in this neighborhood which was Catholic by majority, which Chris described himself as a community of people that were not very happy and where people really wanted to communicate but didn't know how. His father was from Irish descent, so he tried to raise his son in a Catholic environment, and he was enrolled at the elementary school Christ the King that was just in the street across their house. But Chris hated this. He actually hated conformity and hated the rules that were in this Catholic environment. Fuck you, neighbor. Chris in general hated school, but more than anything, he hated the conformity and constant judgment, like environment education. Chris would say about this, quote, "They judge you by the same criteria, make you do the same stuff, you had to wear the same clothes, everything was the same." And he actually almost got expelled from his school because he was a troublesome kid in general, but he liked to question things, which Catholic people apparently didn't like. It is important to mention here in this story that his father was an alcoholic and very abusive man, physically and mentally. Chris's parents, having already raised two kids before him, they didn't really give him much attention, or they didn't, care that much about his behavior or what he did outside the house. Chris would talk about his childhood saying, quote, "I was free to do whatever I wanted as long as the police didn't bring me home." The abuse his father had on the family would mold them into troubled beings, with lots of damage to occur in the coming years. Chris would talk about his childhood and starting how he started to feel depressed since he was a kid. Quote, "I remember having more fun when I was 9 because I had not started becoming depressed yet. At 11, you wake up one day and start feeling bad about everything." So at the age of 11, here we're talking about the 70s, there was a huge recession and Seattle was heavily affected economically speaking. One of the biggest employers in Seattle downsized the number of employees like crazy. So people suddenly, the poor became poor and people were leaving Seattle. To sum up the situation, there was some real estate people who rented a billboard that said, "May the last person leaving Seattle turn off the light." This gives you an idea about what was going on. So in such situations, drug use increased, and then this happened in Seattle to the point where drugs became accessible even to kids of the age of 11 or 12. Backyards of houses in Seattle turned into pharmacies, with everybody just either selling drugs or consuming drugs or doing both. Chris was no exception. He already was a troublesome kid, hang out with older people. So it's no surprise that he got his hands on drugs and started experimenting with them on daily basis, starting from the age of 11, until one day he got a very bad experience with PCP, which is a hallucinogenic drug, kind of drug that creates hallucinations and causes anxiety. And he had a very bad experience with this. He was 13 at that time. This caused him to develop anxiety and panic disorder, and he even developed agoraphobia. After that, he completely stopped, but he wouldn't leave his home for almost 2 years. He barely left home and didn't want to talk to anybody cut off all those people he knew around the time he was using drugs, because for him he didn't speak the same language as them anymore. He didn't want to hang out with them anymore. Way back before this, his mom noted his fascination by music, and how this started actually. It's a funny story about how Chris stole a collection of vinyls from his neighbors. There was this neighbor who was troublesome as well, the club of Chris. So his parents kicked him out of the house, put all his belongings in their basement. So there was the collection of vinyl sitting there in the dust. Chris knew about this, and I think he had like so much curiosity to just like go and grab them and listen to them. He just waited for the perfect opportunity. On a rainy day, he just like went there. I don't know how he sneaked. Maybe he was friends with their other son or something. But anyways, he just like stole this collection of vinyls, took it home, tried them, and sat there listening to them. It's fair to say he actually saved this collection of vinyls. I mean, better than just being damaged because of the rain. And that's when Chris discovers that what was in front of him, this little treasure he stole, was actually a collection of the Beatles vinyls. And for almost a year, he only listened to the Beatles. He discovered a sound he never heard before, and he fell in love with classic rock since then. His mom noted this. She got him a piano when he was just 9. His first attempts at writing music started on this piano in his basement. His impression by the Beatles' music was huge, that he even decided to take one of these vinyls to his teacher at this Catholic school and asked her to play it for the other kids. He thought like, oh, the other kids need to listen to this. Like maybe if they listen to this, they were going to change and become different or something. Not like everybody's the same. Plus the teacher played really boring music, probably like some very like, religious songs there. And Chris wasn't very fond of it, apparently. So he just tried, he took this vinyl to his teacher, asked her to play it. And the teacher just looked at the cover and gave it back to him. This rejection and lack of explanation hurt his feelings. I think that confirmed to him more that he didn't belong at all there. He would talk about Christianity and his Catholic school, saying, quote, "With a religion like that, it's not designed for anyone to question. Being young people who have a natural curiosity and half a brain, you're going to start finding inconsistencies, which there are tons of in organized religion. We both sort of made it clear in classroom," and here he refers to him and his sister. We both sort of made it clear in classroom situations that we didn't get in. Explain this to me, and they couldn't. So we started creating a lot of problems. End quote. And his mom had to take him out of the school because him and his sister almost got expelled. In his mind, he wanted to belong to that world of rock and roll. He just didn't know how at that point. Chris's earliest attempts at writing music caught the attention of his piano teacher, who one day just asked him to sing on a scale to see if he had an ear for music. And once Chris sang, she almost jumped off the stool. And she looked at him in a way that really marked Chris. For Chris, that was a memory that never left his mind. He actually remembers it, saying, quote, "Nobody ever looked at me like that." End quote. For Chris, that was the first time ever somebody noticed him. And this teacher was so impressed and amazed by him and so proud of him that she eventually took him with her to a conference at the University of Washington to show off his creations. I think this experience really gave him a boost and more self-confidence to show up there and keep doing what he was doing. So in his 6th grade, he already participated at a talent show at his school. The tension and dysfunctional environment at home continued to be the way it was. By the age of 15, Chris's parents would finalize their divorce. That was the same year Chris dropped out of school and started again using drugs. And as if the relationship between his parents wasn't crazy enough, Chris at a young age was introduced to relationships in a really negative way. Like his first girlfriend at the age of 16 tried to stab him with a knife at night once. The second one was even crazier, as she tried to attempt suicide when she was with him and tried to even kill her mother. And this didn't help much. So Chris was more of a loner. This, I think, pushed him even more to just keep being the loner he was. Then music became his first love. He loved classic rock so much, but one thing really was a bit bothering him, as he wanted to belong to that world. However, he didn't really see himself being in one of these bands like the Beatles or U2 or Van Halen. He didn't look like them. He didn't feel like he really belonged on a stage there. And he didn't like those looks of, like those hair bands and stuff like that, of the glam shit. He just was not like that. Until he discovered bands like the Velvet Underground and the punk scene in general. And that's when he realized that he could have a place there. First, he loved the music because it was dark and kind of depressed. Actually, that's the punk rock music he loved listening to at that time. He would even talk about this later in interviews, where he would say that he doesn't actually know how to describe this or why he loved sitting in the dark listening to dark music, but he thought that punk rock seemed to make him feel like he was not alone with these dark thoughts and emotions. He realized with punk rock you could look where in any way you want, you could dress up in any way you want, you could be whoever and still have a place on the punk rock stage. Then this became his goal. Like, he wanted to belong there. He wanted to have a place there. By the age of 17, somehow Chris discovered drums. And he one day he sat behind drum kit and he just fell in love there. He felt that that's his place, that's where he belonged. Chris would talk about how drums changed his whole perspective towards his place in music, saying, quote, "Almost overnight I found my place. I felt like this is what I do, this is who I am." He begged his mom to buy him drum kit. Karen was not gonna accept that. She just like thinking about all the noise that this would cause. But Chris didn't let go. He kept begging her, pleading, etc., until she gave in, but she bought him just one snare. Later, he saved like $50 and got the rest of the drum kit for secondhand from a friend. Once he sat behind the drum kit and he had it at his home, it was like heaven for him. He would sit there, like play heavy sounds, because nobody taught him how to play drums. He just was like trying to learn by himself. He thought the basement was soundproof or something, until one day somebody came knocking on his door, and that's when he realized, oh, people can hear him actually play drums. And fortunately for him, this was another teen that came to him saying, "Oh, I heard you were playing drums. Like, I have a band. You want to join me?" And boom, starting from the age of 17 till the age of 19, Chris was in like 10 bands, and he would describe them later as all like awful bands. One day, he saw an ad at a local rock magazine of a guitar player who had a cover rockabilly band looking for a singer and a drummer. Chris at the time only like played the drums. He knew he could sing, but he wanted to do both. And once he met this guy, he realized that he knew nothing about rockabilly. The guy didn't even know how to play a single song of rockabilly. It turns out that this guy, whose name was Matt Dentino, was just a guitar player who wanted to make a cover band just to make money so that he doesn't end up in the streets. This Dentino guy would, however, in an indirect way, change Chris's life forever. This cover band would be called The Shimps, and this was the first band that paved the way for Chris. He met there two guys who were from the suburbs of Chicago. So these guys were Kim Thale, son of Indian immigrants, Hiro Yamamoto, son of Japanese immigrants. Kim at the time was the roommate of Matt Dentino, and they both were guitar players. Kim knew how to play bass as well. Hiro Yamamoto just didn't really know how to play bass, but Kim was the roommate of Dentino and he knew he needed the money, so for his own sake, he just like offered to teach Yamamoto how to play bass. And here we had this band, The Shimps, with Matt Dentino on guitar, Chris Cornell playing drums and singing at the same time, then Hiro Yamamoto on bass. They played some gigs and stuff like that, and it was actually at one of The Shimps gigs that Matt Cameron, who would become the next Soundgarden drummer, saw Chris for the first time, and he was taken by his singing. He remembered that this sounded nothing like something he ever heard before. Surprisingly, I think Chris was the only one who didn't notice that he should really just focus on singing mainly. He wanted to excel in drumming, but he probably knew like he couldn't do both of them at the same time. Eventually, Yamamoto left the band. He just had to focus on other stuff, and Chris Dantino would end up like by themselves again alone. Camtail would be like, okay, fine, I'll come, guys. I'll switch from guitar to bass. I'll come play with you because he just like really felt bad for Dantino. Like he didn't want him to end up homeless, you know. Not a long time after that, the band split and everybody like took a different path. For Dantino, he just ended up being broke. I'm sorry, this is not funny, but it's just like the guy tried so hard to be honest, you know, and but then it's just like didn't work, and he ended up being broke, taken, addicted to drugs, alcoholic, and then boom, he found Jesus, became a born again Christian, abandoned rock music, and nobody knows exactly what he's doing right. I don't even know if he's still alive, honestly. I just feel so bad for this guy because he kind of put them all together, and then his life was fucked up. Anyways, today's story is about Chris, not Dantino. But for the record, Dantino was a good guitarist, and this is mentioned in the biography. So when Chris was with the Champs, he was 19, and he just did his own like solo career, you know, playing at bars and stuff like that, until he really got just so bored of playing other people's music and wanted to start his own thing. And that's when he reached out again for Yamamoto, and he moved in with him. Chris like learned also how to play guitar, so just like right away the next day they started making music, playing music, just jamming together, you know. And eventually they knew they needed a guitar player, so Yamamoto reached out for Camtail, and now we got this trio in this homemade studio making music there, and they all got along. There was this insane chemistry between of them. And suddenly we had this trio: a white drummer slash singer, a Japanese bass player, and Indian guitar player. This was very unheard of in Seattle at the time. And within 2 weeks, they made 15 songs that they put on a cassette, and they started like just playing, you know, different gigs and stuff like that. So they chose the name Soundgarden in tribute to a public organ pipe sculpture that created sounds in the wind. Not sounds like this. With the arrival of drummer Scott Sandquist, Cornell moved to singing and playing guitar full-time and performed at the same clubs as Nirvana and Alice in Chains. The name Soundgarden unexpectedly played a beneficial role in the beginning of their career, as people would come to gigs where Soundgarden were opening or one of the acts. They would say the name Soundgarden and they would expect seeing, you know, some, I don't know, boys band playing vanilla music. But then Soundgarden would come and the sound ends up being heavy and people would be like, whoa. The punk scene hated Soundgarden in the beginning.
And Soundgarden was not a band that was immediately liked by any stretch. The Seattle music scene at the time was really sort of made up of other bands as your audience. I think it really formed me as a musician and maybe even as a person, and that you have that decision to make, I think, at that time when you believe in the music that you're writing and that you're playing, and you may not necessarily be liked by everyone, but we had the perseverance and the attitude that we believed in what we were doing, and so we just kept doing it anyway.
Later on, Soundgarden would open for Faith No More. They would give this cassette tape to the drummer of Faith No More. Eventually, this cassette tape finds its way to the hands of a local host, radio host in Seattle.
And then a woman named Faith Henschel ran the local college station at the University of Washington, and she sent a tape of Seattle bands out to some major labels. And the tape was titled Bands That Will Make Money. And it was kind of a joke, I think, in her mind, but she really believed in what was happening in Seattle at the time and that it could be the future of rock music.
Soon, to everybody's surprise, Chris's phone wouldn't stop ringing, with major labels offering to sign Soundgarden. However, this wasn't really what Chris and his friends were waiting for. They rejected all these offers because they didn't want to be told what they had to do.
And it was also, you know, the realization that this can happen without us changing our clothes, changing our hair, changing the titles of our songs, doing anything differently than what we do, because we knew that we would never do that. And that was always my fear along the whole way, was that we were not capable of changing who we were for anyone, for an audience, for a record company, for television, for anything. So
right after he dropped out of school and collapsed into drugs again, Chris started working in different restaurants, mainly a fish restaurant where he would work for a long time later. Different kind of jobs, from the dirtiest job of like washing the dishes to preparing the sauce and working under the sous chefs. He was also a sous chef at a known restaurant in Seattle. He had a weird sense of humor with his colleagues while working in this restaurant. There were his pastimes involved like tricking the chef into smelling leftovers or asking him to taste a sauce that had gone bad. He also had this weird behavior, which I don't know if he thought it's funny. He would come some days and like spend days not talking to anybody, not even a single word. Even if they talked to him, he wouldn't answer. And he kept working in this restaurant until the first few Soundgarden tours, because he wasn't making any money from music at that time. One of the advantages of working in restaurants is having free food. I mean, I did that. It was cool. You know, you really save so much by working in restaurants because food costs lots of money. And Chris at that time and his bandmates didn't have much. So there was food. Plus, Chris is used to stealing. So in that restaurant, they had like sort of warehouse where Chris was able to have access, and there they put like, you know, old chairs, old doors, old furniture. Chris literally used all those as furniture for his home. He says, quote, I stole things that were just sort of not used anymore, that they would store in a warehouse next to the restaurant that basically rats and cats would pee on. I would go and take the old restaurant tables and chairs, and that would become my table and chairs. They had doors stacked up, so I would take a door and that would be my front door. But it's funny how he always had really valid excuse for stealing, whether when he stole the Beatles collection of vinyls from his neighbor's home or when he took stuff from this restaurant. You know, it always makes sense. Chris recalls a night where he was driving home after his night shift in '69, and on this drive he was thinking about the trajectory of his life, and he described this as a sort of epiphany. Chris would say, quote, it was like an epiphany. It occurred to me that there was no guarantee that as a musician I would ever have any kind of financial success, but I was fine with that. And on this drive, I remember making a promise to myself that no matter what happens in terms of success, I was going to be one of those guys playing music until he drops dead. In the 80s, Chris met with this woman who was a manager of Alice in Chains, and she had a good network in the music industry. She would become his girlfriend. They started dating, and eventually she became the manager of Soundgarden. Not a long time after that, they got an offer from an independent label, Sub Pop, for which they got signed. Soundgarden released the Screamin' Live EP in 1987, and the FOP EP in 1988. Then they got signed to SST, which was also an independent label, and released their debut album, Ultra Mega OK, for which they earned a Grammy for the Best Metal Performance in 1990.
How do you guys feel about being nominated for a Grammy?
You know, it's really one of those things where you got to pinch yourself, you know, just to make sure that you're not dreaming. I'm gonna just go ahead and pinch him right now.
I think pinch him right here.
Oh, there's a lot of skin. I think there's some skin right there. Anyway, it's wonderful. It's really wonderful.
It's
We're all
swell.
really ecstatic.
Actually, I really don't care too much about it. It'd be really nice if.
Well, bring us down.
Okay, it's great. It's fantastic.
This decision would end up being one of the decisions that Chris and his friends regretted, because as much as they wanted to be signed to an independent label, this experience, however, didn't feel right because they were not giving like the choice to choose the producer, and they didn't have, or they didn't feel they had a real connection with the producer who worked on this album. And given the fact that the reason they refused being signed to a major label was exactly this, they didn't want to be told what to do. They wanted to do it their own way. So eventually they accepted a deal from A&M in 1989, and with this they became the first grunge band to ever be signed to a major label. This created lots of criticism and fans like fired back because there was the grunge movement. And by the way, Chris and his friends never really considered themselves grunge, and they didn't even believe that grunge was a concept or a genre. And they thought that it's the press that gave them this label or put them in this category. So fans got divided, and there was like attack from people who used to love them and suddenly didn't, or just like they were criticizing them. It's because most of their fans were punk rock people, and these people don't support major labels. They want to support independent labels. So for them, with Soundgarden signing to this means like Soundgarden losing a huge aspect of itself, as if they are giving up on their identity or giving up on their roots. This woman who became their manager, her name was Susan Silva. She became the wife of Chris later. But in 1990, Chris lost one of his closest friends, Andrew Wood, vocalist of Mother Love Bone, who died after a heroin overdose. Wood was one of his roommates. At that same time, Chris's marriage was falling apart. To pay tribute for his late friend, he started with some of his other friends a distribute project called Temple of the Dog. Initially, their plan was to just release a song, Say Hello to Heaven. However, they ended up releasing a whole album via A&M Records in 1991. Soundgarden would have its first commercial breakthrough in 1994 with their album Super Unknown, which was after Kurt Cobain's death. Kurt Cobain was an admirer of Soundgarden, by the way. In one of the advertisements he once published, while looking for a drummer for Nirvana, he actually mentioned Soundgarden as one of the references he wanted the drummer he's looking for to have. So he just like put on the advertisement for references, like the drummer, I don't give a shit about your hair or look, blah, blah, blah. For references, Soundgarden and other bands he mentioned. That says a lot. He liked Soundgarden. Chris Cornell was also a fan of like Nirvana. He didn't know Kurt personally, but he was really hit hard after Kurt's death. Speaking to Howard Stern about Kurt Cobain's death, Chris said, "It's a shame for his daughter for one. It's a shame for the fans. But really, it's a personal thing. I wish it didn't happen." I also think that if he had just kind of hang on for 6 months, who knows? 6 months later, he would have been a completely different guy. I feel in this part that Chris related to Kurt, because Chris started using drugs started from the age of 11, and he admitted to starting feeling depressed starting from the age of 11. So he used drugs as a coping mechanism. There was this violence at his home. He didn't feel like he belonged, and he had this depression and was a loner, and for him drugs were a way to cope with all of it. You know, he stopped taking drugs once he was with Soundgarden. Rock music and making music became his coping mechanism. Soundgarden's last studio album, Down on the Upside, released in 1996. Gosh, I was just a few months old at that time. This album reached number 6 in the UK charts before the breakup of Soundgarden in 1997. The band members were no longer having fun making music. They mentioned the hectic touring schedule and internal conflicts as the reasons of the breakup. By 1999, Susan Silva and Chris Cornell got separated, and the year later he would become a father. Without Soundgarden, Cornell's life just fell apart. Inspired by the straight edge hardcore punk movement, Soundgarden had always been drugs free.
And I literally have friends that would come to a Soundgarden show and be backstage in the dressing room and be looking around and be completely disappointed because it looked just like this. Maybe there would be a bottle of whiskey on the table or something, but that was it. There were no drugs, there were no prostitutes or groupies or anything like that. And we would be having kind of roundtable discussions and arguments about philosophy and things that interested us and playing records for each other.
But suddenly, Chris was using everything. Because the breakup of Soundgarden came around the same time where his marriage was falling apart. So there was this personal life crisis that Chris was going through. And it only had an end in 2002 when Audioslave was formed with Rage Against the Machine band members. His divorce was finalized in 2004, and it was so complicated, Chris had only gained access back to his own guitars 4 years later. He ended up in rehab, and after that, after his divorce, and Chris would talk about this period of his life saying, quote, "It was the most difficult period of my life. I'm lucky I got through it. I'm not sure if it was the best place for me, but it worked," end quote. And since then, Cornell has had to reevaluate his life. He's now like this sober, non-smoker, a father, and a member of Audioslave. And this was reflected even on his music, because suddenly the music changed. Like the lyrics went from being dark to more hopeful. Later on, he got married to Vicky and started traveling a lot between LA and Paris because his wife's family lives in Paris. He won a prize for his contributions in helping victims of addiction dealing with their problems. He reached this stage of his life where he was sober, a better person, a better father, better artist, and he already reached this status of being one of the rock legends, something he always dreamt of becoming. He also started a parallel career as a restaurateur in Paris. This is not really surprising. He worked in restaurants for years. Chris would talk about this, saying if it wasn't for the music, he would probably ended up in this career, like having his own restaurant, you know. He loved doing different stuff. So at this point, one might think that, well, finally, he made it. Like now he reached balance. Now his life is doing fine. Chris succeeded at getting over his anxiety and addiction problems and everything. Good for him. In 2014, Chris talked to the Rolling Stone about the period surrounding the Super Unknown album, revealing that he was dealing with depression at the time. He said, quote, "I'd noticed in my life there would be periods where I would feel like things are not going so well. They were not based on any particular thing. There wasn't a catastrophe, there wasn't a relationship split, nobody got in a car wreck. My outlook just changed. It was kind of a terrifying thought. I wanted to write a song about that." And he wrote Fell on Black Days. So that song talks about his struggle with depression. And it is sad because we see that he kept on trying different stuff, taking different paths, making efforts to just like move on and get away from this black hole called depression. However, his demons never let go of him, and he was still fighting even at that time. Between 2010 2017, there was a lot happening in Chris's musical career, namely his reunion with Soundgarden guys. There was this new Soundgarden website to make a platform for their street team where different new announcements, the new music, various American and UK shows, even a song featured in the Avengers. In February 2011, Soundgarden started working on a new album. 2 months later, they announced a summer tour consisting of 4 dates in July. They had different tours and shows at the time until May 18, 2017, where Cornell was found dead.
Died. Chris Cornell, lead singer of Soundgarden, was found dead from an apparent suicide in his hotel room at MGM Grand last night after a show right here in Detroit at the Fox Theater. Local 4's Jason Colthorpe was actually at that show last night. He's covering this for us today. And Jason, this is just a shock for everyone, fans of his music.
Absolutely, just unreal, Evron, to wake up to this news, especially having been there. And I just know personally, I have to be doing what everyone else at that show is doing today, and that's replaying the entire show in our heads, wondering what did we see? Did we see something that would have led us to believe that this was possible? And as we are learning today, there were some signs. Of course, it was a great show, but one of those signs people are pointing to today was the song Soundgarden closed with last night, and it was a cover of a Led Zeppelin song called In My Time of Dying, and it includes the lyric, "I want nobody to mourn, all I want for you to do is take my body home." Chris Cornell singing those lyrics and singing for the final time last night at the Fox Theater.
I hate to remember some of my favorite artists with their death memories, and I wanted today to be more like a day where we remember the time he had on this life, and we can be grateful that we lived during the same time as a legend like him. And I'm hoping that at least I was able to kind of bring the story of Chris in a way where we think more about his life than his death. Thank you for watching.